I see some familiar faces. Hi, June.
How are you, Dave?
Good. John, do you want to say anything?
Sure. Are we ready to start?
Not yet.
I just came from the that infrastructure conference that we had talked about, and it was pretty good. They were going through the transportation part of the infrastructure bill, and lots of funding for passenger rail, which of course was music to my
Yeah. Good. Well, so I'm going to tweak the schedule here a little bit. I'm going to do a welcome. I'm going to introduce John Weidenhammer, who's the chair of the Berks Alliance. He will do another brief welcome, and then I'll come back and do the process stuff about the questions and the chat function, and then turn it over to you, Tim.
Okay, thank you.
And we'll be starting in a couple minutes here. Thank you all for joining us today.
Hi, Dave.
Tufan, how are you?
Very good. How about you?
Good, like the background.
Yes. I'm in front of Francis.
Got my clock ticking here telling me when we can start.
I still have a minute to go, Dave. So I think you're in good shape.
As long as Leanne doesn't leave us.
She looks pretty
For the
solidly.
duration.
Yeah, she looks pretty solidly in place to me.
Good. Oh, we're getting there.
Yeah, I think, Dave, if you give it another minute, we can at least start the introduction so we can get ready to rock and roll.
Yeah, we're getting there. People are coming in pretty steadily, so.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I think we're going to get started. We're going to be letting people in as we move along here. One of the nice things about Zoom is people can join the meeting late and they're not disrupting us like we would do if we were meeting in person, but it'd be nice to see real people in person. I'm Dave Myers. I'm work for the Berks Alliance, which is a consortium of the anchor institutions here in Berks County. And I want to welcome you to this event. I'm going to turn it over really briefly to John Weidenhammer, who's the chair of the Berks Alliance, and he'll do a brief introduction and welcome.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And Dave, thanks for that introduction. So great to see so many smiling faces here in the middle of the week. Normally, we have these Berks Alliance community conversations on the third Thursday of the month, but today we have a special topic, and we thought we'd kind of go a little bit out of sequence. And I'm grateful to our presenters and organizers for putting this session together, which I think is really going to be informative, because we're going to talk about a economic forecast for 2021. And our friends at the 3rd District Federal Reserve have really been great partners in helping us over time put on these sessions. So I'll just say thanks to everybody. I hope everybody had a great Passover. Hope you enjoy the Easter weekend, and hopefully we'll get some nice weather for the weekend. But in any event, thanks so much for being with us, and please continue to tune in and support these community conversations. So Dave, back to you.
Thank you, John. I'm going to cover some ground rules really quickly here. We're going to ask you to stay muted during the presentations. We will ask you to use the chat function, which you can find at the bottom of the screen, to submit questions. We'll do questions and answers at the end of the program. If we run out of time, we will collect all the questions and answers. Leanne's agreed that we can send her those questions and answers and comments, as long as they're polite. And she'll get back to us with her responses. We will have then the ability to send out those responses to everybody. So if you don't get your question answered today, it will be answered fairly quickly. As John said, this is a program where we're going to be looking at a national and regional economic forecast. And we have a good relationship with the Federal Reserve Bank in many ways here in Berks County, including we have 2 people who are among the 9 directors for the entire Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank, which means Berks County, it's one place where Berks County is well represented. And I'm going to turn it over to them quickly. I'm going to start with Tim Snyder, who is the CEO of Fleetwood Bank. Tim?
Thank you, Dave, and thank you for allowing Julie and I the opportunity to offer some thoughts on the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. The Philly Fed is one of 12 regional reserve banks that, together with the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., make up the Federal Reserve System. As the central bank of the nation, we work to ensure the strength and integrity of the U.S. economy and financial system. The Fed's mission is to create the conditions that generate jobs, promote price stability, and foster economic growth. And at the Philly Fed, we help shape the nation's monetary policy, supervise and regulate financial institutions, support the safe and efficient operation of the U.S. payments and financial system, and promote fair and impartial access to credit and inclusive growth. Just a couple of facts about the 3rd District. It's home to 13.3 million people in Delaware, Southern New Jersey, and Eastern and Central PA. That's 4.6% of the country's population in just 1% of the country's land. The district has slightly higher employment in the education and health service sectors than that of the nation. And as provided by the Federal Reserve Act, each of the 12 reserve banks is supervised, as Dave said, by a 9-member board of directors. The directors oversee the bank's direction and performance and participate in the formulation of the Fed's monetary policy through the reports on economic and financial conditions and their decisions on the bank's discount rate. In addition to serving on the board, Julia is a member of the Management and Budget Committee, and I chair the Audit Committee of the bank. And I'll turn it over to Julia Klein, Chairwoman and CEO of Berks County-based CH Briggs. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. So you've just heard about what the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank does and what Tim and I do. I should say that what we don't do is personally set the nation's interest rates. So there's no need to call us afterwards. So this event is just one of several. It's been held by the Berks Alliance in collaboration with the Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia. 2 weeks ago, we had a community forum focused on a skills-based approach to job training and occupational mobility. It was a really great session, and discussions are continuing about how the Fed can help local employers. It's just one example of the work the Federal Reserve is doing right here in the 3rd District in Berks County. Today, we're delighted to have Leanne Wilkins with us. She's an economic outreach associate with the bank in Philadelphia. She'll provide us with insights about where the economy here in Berks County and across the United States may be headed in the future. She began her career as a quantitative analysis in the Supervision, Regulation, and Credit Department of the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank, and that started her interest in consumer credit. She largely studies consumer credit risk, seeking answers that improve the financial decisions of consumers, as well as to help facilitate safety within the consumer credit market. This is a real specialty of the Philadelphia Fed. She's currently studying aggregate fluctuations in credit scores over the business cycle up and down, as well as intergenerational credit behaviors. As an economic outreach associate, Leanne speaks to businesses and groups like ours and financial leaders throughout the 3rd District about local business conditions, macroeconomic trends, and monetary policy. She's a great combination of nerdy and practical, and she's here today to help us bridge the gap between what economists think and what the general public knows, so we can all make better economic decisions. She says the highlight of her work is knowing that what she does helps to inform and educate people in our communities. Leanne has a master's degree in applied economics from Drexel and dual bachelor's degrees in economics and psychology from West Virginia University. We're so pleased to have you with us here today, Leanne. Welcome to Berks County.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Julia. And thank you so much, Tim, for that lovely introduction of the Federal Reserve Bank. It's a great institution, and we love that you continue to have a relationship with us and invite us back. So with that said, I will kick off my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen? Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, so I have to start each of these presentations with the same disclaimer, and that disclaimer is that the views expressed today are my own, and they do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. What this means is if I say anything crazy or outlandish, you cannot sue the bank, but you can potentially sue me. I ask that you don't. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off this presentation with this poll everywhere technology that's going to be implemented throughout the presentation. I have around 4 or 5 questions for you guys. And this is a way to sort of keep you guys engaged while we lack that real world interaction. So if you guys go to this link, you can do it on your smartphone or your tablet or your laptop, and you can choose to enter your initials or skip. It doesn't really matter. And then you should see a screen that says waiting for the presentation to begin. As I approach each question and I get there, you guys will have the opportunity to answer it. I'll give you guys about a minute to answer each question, and then I will show you guys the answers from your group. So it's a really fun way to keep it interactive and to also get your guys' input about how you feel about the outlook that I'm about to present to you guys. So we'll do this quick test question. So we'll ask you, what is the primary market that you serve? Once I get, quite a few of you guys answered, I will stop it. So it looks like we have, I think at my last check, we had around 40 individuals. So I'll try to get the majority of you in there to be safe on time. And no worries, each of these slides will have that link. So if anybody's late, they'll be able to just log in and answer the questions as they go. Looks like we're getting answers really, really fast here. Looks like we're about 18, 20. Looks like we sort of leveled off, so I'll go ahead and show you guys the responses. So it looks like around 50% of you guys are in Southeastern PA. A smaller percentage of you guys serve Central PA, and multiple regions are across across Pennsylvania. So the setup of these questions will look very similar to this as we move through the presentation. And if you guys would like the results of these at the end, I'm more than happy to share those with you guys. So let's get started. So gross domestic product is the broadest measure of health of the US economy. As I'm sure many of you already know. It's broken down into 5 components. The first is consumption, which makes up around 70% of gross domestic product. So it's not surprising that when you look at this red piece, which represents real gross domestic product overall, it looks very similar to the blue piece because it makes up the majority of that. So each of these bars represents 1 quarter of growth going back 4 quarters. We then have investment, which makes up around 17 or 18% of gross domestic product. Exports and imports together make up -4%. And then government spending, again, is 17 or 18%. In the most recent recession, the COVID-19 recession that we're experiencing right now, we saw the largest contraction on record in the third quarter. And that was a decline of 33.4%. It's important to note that this contraction was largely led by two sectors, which was consumption and investment. Consumption declined 33.4%, very similar to gross domestic product as a whole, and investment declined 86.3%. In the most recent quarter, we've seen a rebound of gross domestic product. So to sort of put this in perspective, from the beginning of the pandemic to the trough, we started with around $21.6 trillion of gross domestic product. And by the trough of the recession, we had about $19.5 trillion. So we lost around $2.2 trillion in gross domestic product. At this point, we've gained back $2 trillion, and we still need around $260 billion to be where we were before the recession started. In the most recent quarter, we saw gains. This is quarter 4 of 2020. We saw large gains in investment, namely non-residential fixed investment and private inventory investment. These were led by manufacturing and wholesale trade, but we did see some decreases in retail trade, as well as increases in terms of non-residential fixed investments. This was led by equipment, namely travel equipment. In terms of personal consumption expenditures, those increases that we have seen have been led by services, namely healthcare, which we did see take a big hit in the beginning of the pandemic, so that's good to see. And we did see a decrease of spending on goods, which was largely led by food and beverage. So this is the overall outlook of what the economy looks like. In the coming quarter, companies like IHS Markit predict that the economy will expand at a rate of 5.3%, which is stronger than originally expected. I think estimates were originally around 4.5%, but we had an unexpectedly robust credit and debit card sales in early March. And we also had earlier than expected stimulus payments, which are contributing to these estimates of how strongly the economy will continue to grow. But economists do believe that growth will pick up even further as we move through this spring because more Americans will be getting vaccinated, and business restrictions, we expect business restrictions to continue to ease as the weather lightens up. So this leads me into the outline of what this presentation is going to look like. We're going to start with what the impact has been to businesses. That'll be the first section. The second section will cover how consumers have reacted to this COVID-19 recession so far. And then we'll end with what we can expect in the near term. So we'll start this next section, which what has the impact been to businesses, with another survey question. So the first question I have for you guys is, overall, what has been the impact, or what has been the effect of the pandemic to your business? Are people able to answer? I'm not seeing any responses. Are people having trouble answering?
It's this is Andy Funk. It's still asking me the first question. I don't know if it's just me.
Did that help?
No, it's still.
I have 28 responses to this question.
I have it, but it's not letting me click on anything or taking my answer.
I was able to. Mine worked.
Mine too. I have
Yeah, I was able to see the questions and click on the answer as well.
Okay, perfect. Well, I have 28 responses, so we will just go from here with interest of time. So I'll go ahead and show you guys the responses. So around 50% of you saw a moderate to negative effect to your businesses. Some of you saw little to none. Looks like almost 60% of you saw some negative effect. And you guys aren't alone. So the net revenue of small businesses and small business as a whole has been severely impacted by this recession. So what this figure shows us is net revenue that it's indexed to January and February of 2020. So these are percent decreases from that time and what it looks like since the beginning of the pandemic. We see at the beginning of the pandemic, this drops off really sharply, and then we pick back up. But the net revenue of small businesses seems to have stagnated well below the levels that we were seeing pre-pandemic. There's a lot of factors affecting this. Number one, this is the net revenue of small businesses. You have to factor in that the number of open small businesses has declined significantly as well. So if there are less small businesses, there's less revenue coming into those streams, which is a negative impact of that. And also the fact that a lot of small businesses fall into these leisure and hospitality sectors, which were very, very hard hit by the pandemic. Recovery again has stagnated. In the most recent weeks, we've actually seen a bit of a pickup in net revenue of small businesses, which is sort of into contrast of what we've seen. We've most recently seen that there's really not any sustained recovery, especially as we saw these really sharp declines coming in the beginning of February. Hopefully this pickup continues as we move through March and the weather gets warmer and people start going out and supporting local business. This net revenue within these small businesses has a large impact on payroll employment, because if there are less small businesses, there are less jobs. And what we can see here is that the pace of this recovery has slowed significantly. So what I've posted here in this figure is the change in monthly US payroll employment over time. If you had seen this figure, if you've seen presentations from the past, you certainly have. These bars to the left look very, very small. And those are generally standard levels of gains for employment over the last 8 years. And what you should note is that according to economists, anything between 70,000 and 120,000 jobs gained is considered healthy growth. In the most recent year, we saw jobs drop by 22 million, 22.4 million to be exact, which is shown by this decline in the dark green line, and then this huge decline in April. So that's March and April. At this point in the recovery, you can see that we have recovered 12.9 million jobs, and that's through all of these months. In December, we actually lost some jobs, but we had some pretty strong gains in February, about 379,000 jobs. With the economy as it stands, we still have around 9 million jobs to recover to be where we were prior to the start of the pandemic. This pandemic has largely impacted lower income households. Upper income households have largely already recovered from the job losses that they faced during the COVID-19 recession, while lower wage positions actually make up the vast majority of eliminated jobs that we have seen. So these numbers continue, show continued pain for affected workers. If we look at this job recovery regionally, we can see that the impacts are very geographic. We'll also see that at the regional level as well. So what this figure shows is the number of jobs, or the percentage of jobs that have been regained from the trough. So for most states, the trough is going to be April. For some, it may have been May. So how many jobs have we gotten back from complete job loss to recovery? So what we see is that the leisure and hospitality sectors were very, very hardly hit. So states that are most dependent on those sectors have largely faced tougher recoveries. Many states in the Northeast have a large reliance on leisure and hospitality, and also experienced an exceptionally harsh winter. And they've likely had a harder time recovering employment due to very limited outdoor seating. But as we see temperatures rise, these are things that will help that employment recover a little more steadily. On the other hand, if you look at California, California is the largest contributor of tourism in the entire country. And additionally, it was actually one of the hardest hit states by COVID. So it's not shocking that they're facing a little bit tougher of a recovery. And then you can notice that a bunch of southern states seem to be doing a bit better or faring a bit better. They in general have faced more lenient COVID restrictions and much more moderate climates. So the fact that they've recovered a little more strongly is not surprising. When we take a look at the same figure for the regional level, just for those of you who don't know, the Federal Reserve is just the third district. The Federal Reserve third district covers just just east of Pittsburgh, and the southern half of New Jersey and all of Delaware. And you can gonna see that areas with higher dependency on more severely impacted sectors suffered large losses. If you look at State College up here, you can see that they had a lot of students that went home and went virtual. So a lot of the businesses that are supported by those students have seen a large decrease in the revenue that they're seeing, and more layoffs with that respect. If you look at Philadelphia, also one of those darker shades of reds in terms of the amount of jobs that we have recovered. And that has a lot to do with our large dependency on hospitality as well as the health and education sectors. Reading and surrounding MSAs seem to be experiencing stronger job recovery comparatively, especially when compared to Philadelphia or some of the MSAs or the majority of the MSAs in New Jersey. So one other way we can sort of analyze employment is we can look at annual employment growth by sector. So what I've done here is I have broken down annual employment growth by the US, PA, as well as the Reading MSA. So the state, so Pennsylvania experienced a loss of 1.1 million jobs from peak to trough. At this point, we've gained back around 694,000 jobs. So that's about 61% recovered. Your specific MSA lost around 37,000 jobs from peak to trough, and you've now gained back 21%, or I mean, I'm sorry, 21,000 jobs, and that stands at around 58% of jobs gained. As we saw in the earlier figure, the pace of this recovery has slowed down. Some sectors have recovered much more strongly, regaining more than 65% of the jobs they've lost so far. However, several other sectors are far from the levels they were experiencing pre-pandemic. So for example, if you look at leisure and hospitality, which was this hardest hit sector, it remains in the MSA in the United States around 20% smaller than it was prior to the pandemic. But then if you look at the financial sector within your MSA has entirely recovered all of the jobs that were lost as of March of last year. The vast majority of sectors are around 5 to 10% smaller than they were about a year ago. So the transition here is, where does this leave American households, and how are American households reacting to the stressors within the labor market? So we'll start this section again with a question. And that question is, what is your assessment of a typical American household's financial health a year from now? So I'll wait till we get a few more answers, and then I will go ahead and display the results. Okay. So many of you, nearly 70% of you, believe that American households will be better off a year from now than they are right now. Some of you believe it'll be around the same. Some of you will believe it'll be a little worse off. There's a lot of uncertainty in this outlook, but consumers overall are starting to have their consumer confidence levels rise in comparison to what they were prior to the pandemic. So what I've displayed here are 3 different consumer confidence indices, which represent consumer confidence or sentiment for the entire nation. And what these measure is how optimistic or pessimistic consumers are regarding their financial situation. And that's measured based on consumers' activities of saving and spending. So in March, the most recent reading, you can see that this purple consumer confidence for the Conference Board had a big spike in March. The University of Michigan also saw a spike. These are the largest rises we've seen in a year. This is largely in part to a growing number of people becoming vaccinated, as well as the passage and distribution of Biden's relief measures most recently. Consumer assessment of these different measures. So these are broken down into several different components. The pieces that were most highly impacted by this indice were current conditions and then conditions of the short-term outlook, both of which had elements that improved significantly. And this is really important because it's an indication that economic growth is on the horizon and will strengthen in months to come. Consumers have more optimism in buying large scale purchases like homes, cars, and other big ticket items. And something that caused a bit of a decline was worries about inflation. However, consumers are really confident in their in better business conditions coming up. More people believe that there will be more jobs in the months ahead. They also believe that so their current business, they believe an increase in current business conditions as well as future business conditions. So it is important to note that previous months of these indices reported measures that households with incomes more than $75,000 or higher, that's where gains in confidence were concentrated. However, the gains in March were actually widespread across all socioeconomic subgroups and all regions. The largest monthly gains within this subsection of the indice were for households in the bottom third of the income distribution, as well as those aged 55 and older, which had much lower expectations and confidence levels in prior months. So while consumer confidence indices are rebounding, we're still facing a lot of uncertainty within the mortgage market. So this figure shows us the percentage of mortgages that are 90 days past due. We see that delinquencies spike to levels higher than we saw during the 2008 housing crisis. They've dropped a little bit in the fourth quarter, which is a sign that some people are, or at least a proportion of the population is being able to recover and take advantage of these forbearance measures. It also is important to note that the Mortgage Bankers Association data that provides this includes mortgages that are in 90 days past due, regardless of their forbearance status. And this is in an effort to capture the true picture of struggling borrowers. The reason the data includes loans in forbearance as delinquent is because once these moratoriums end for forbearance and foreclosures, individuals are actually still required to pay these missed payments. They will have several options, including lengthening the loan term, as well as mortgage modifications. But some borrowers will face things like lump sum payments or repayment plans that are actually stacked on top of their regular monthly payments. And this is all depending upon the agreement that was made with their lender. So the Mortgage Bankers Association just wants to have a clear picture of what delinquencies could possibly look like once these moratoriums end. Fortunately, the most recent federal regulators extended those federal forbearance programs through the end of June 2021. So we know that some people have been severely impacted or will be severely impacted at the end when these moratoriums end, namely those working in leisure and hospitality sector who have lost vast amounts of income, while others have faced little to no impact from the current recession. So this leads me to ask you guys, how has your overall spending changed since the pandemic began? Looks like we've leveled off at around 29, so I'll go ahead and show you guys the responses. So it looks like the majority of you have seen a moderate decrease in your spending or in some decrease category. So if you are in that category of people that are spending less, then you're likely saving more and you're not alone. The personal savings rate in the United States is at historically high levels. The weak spending that was triggered by this recession has left Americans with a very high level of savings. And fortunately, that could allow us to boost spending later in the year. Savings rates were extremely high in the wake of stimulus back in March of 2020, where we see this huge peak up to nearly 35%. And then we received another stimulus in January, where we see that second peak. In March, we expect those numbers to peak again because those numbers will reflect that third round of stimulus that hit this month. However, it's important to note that the personal savings rate in months that didn't receive a stimulus is sitting around 13.5%, which is much, much higher than the pre-pandemic level of 8%. So excluding 2020, the savings rate, excluding last year, the savings rate currently is at the highest level it's ever been since 1975. Collectively, households have saved $1.4 trillion in the first 9 months of last year. That's about twice as much as they would have saved a year prior. And there are several other reasons that people are able to save money. One of the big things is the stimulus checks, as I mentioned. But the other thing is student borrowers who have had their loans put into forbearance interest-free have also freed up some money that they are likely able to save instead of spend. It's hard to tell how much of this saving will actually persist as the majority of the population becomes vaccinated and restrictions continue to ease. There is a possibility that the savings rate will remain elevated, but there's also a possibility that savings rate will decrease drastically back down to trend once consumers resume normal activities. What will actually happen likely lies somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. Either way, an increased personal savings rate represents a structural change in people's behavior of saving and spending. This isn't the only, so people's behaviors likely changed, at least in the short term, but this isn't the only structural change or uncertainty that is a possibility when it comes to spending. The way people are spending their money has also seen quite a fluctuation. So what this figure shows us is that the share of e-commerce as a share of retail sales. We can see that this had an upward trend prior to the pandemic. Anyways, it was trending upward. And then we hit the pandemic and this accelerated as people were unable to leave their homes and really didn't have a lot of alternatives to online shopping. We see this drop in Q4 of 2020, but it's still well above pre-pandemic levels. It's hard for us, I mean, it's still well above pre-pandemic levels, even as retailers are allowing people to come back in their stores and open up. Some of this shift is likely not permanent, similar to the last figure that we saw. And as more vaccines are distributed and people feel more comfortable leaving their homes, we may see a drop further. We may see this level drop a little further. However, there's not really a good way for us to know how much of this change will just be structurally different as restrictions are lifted. So another potential cause of spending changes comes from commuting patterns. So how we work during this recession has changed dramatically since the beginning of the pandemic. Close to a fifth of people report that they now work from home every day. So this is from a study out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and it is asking respondents what their commuting patterns are back in February. So that's the first bar. And then we can see how that has changed over time from May through December of 2020. The share of those commuting every day has dropped from around 3/4 to a half. As pandemic restrictions are lifted, some employees will shift back to their regular commuting patterns, although it's hard to discern the amount of workers who will remain virtual permanently or will remain virtual at least part of the time. And this has really large or potentially large impacts on several areas of the economy, namely small business. Commuters generally shop at their local businesses, which are near their works or their workplaces or their offices. And if a portion of them don't return or only return but return at a lower rate, this will have an impact on the revenue of those businesses. There's also potential for structural implications in terms of the types of businesses that remain open in certain areas, as well as the type and volume of construction that's pursued in areas such as cities, because there is this move of people to get more space, and they also have lost this restriction of needing to live near work. So they have more flexibility to work remotely and more flexibility to live in different areas. So this also can have big implications or broad implications for the housing market as well. So these potential structural changes can cause a lot of uncertainty in the short and even the longer term outlooks. Analysts and economists alike are having to take in these changes in real time to be able to make projections about where they think the economy is headed. And these rapid changes are actually causing severe fluctuations in predictions. So that is a good segue into what we can expect in the near term. So if you look at US economic growth projections, which I've displayed here, this is for 2021 real GDP growth. These projections are from the Survey of Professional Forecasters. This survey is produced out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and it into account opinions of economists and analysts across the United States, as well as across a variety of sectors. So what this figure is comparing is the forecasters' predictions as of the middle of November, and then comparing to the most current predictions as of mid-February. What we can see is that over the course of just a few months, forecasters have become a lot more optimistic about 2021's GDP growth. They believe it's going to be quite a bit higher. In the previous survey, the majority of respondents, which is represented by these red lines, expected GDP to be around 3.9% or less. While in the most recent projections, the majority of respondents expect growth to be as high as 6.9%. It's also important to note that in the face of so much uncertainty, there is considerable variation across the spectrum for these projections. And that is true for both the previous and current GDP projections. So even through all of this uncertainty, businesses within the third district specifically have solid and positive expectations about the future. So what I've done here is displayed a question from the Business Outlook survey, both the Manufacturing Business Outlook survey and the Non-Manufacturing Business Outlook survey. They're both conducted out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and they surveyed businesses across our district about their expectations of business conditions. The question I've displayed here asks respondents how they feel about business conditions today compared to 6 months from now. And the results are displayed as a diffusion index. So what the diffusion index does is it takes the percentage of respondents who report an increase in their expected activity, less those who report a decrease in their expected activity. And when this index is positive, that means the majority of respondents expect increases and vice versa. So in the most recent reading, more than 60% of respondents, so the most recent reading is for March, in the most recent reading, more than 60% of respondents in both manufacturing and non-manufacturing sectors are reporting that they expect increases in their business conditions in the coming months. So it's important to note that non-manufacturing was hit much harder than manufacturing. So we do see a dip in those expectations because the service sectors were just hit a lot harder due to lockdown restrictions. So it is, with that said, it is really important to note that the non-manufacturing sector jumping up to these really high levels in terms of this diffusion index leads us to indications of a hopeful recovery as we move through this pandemic. So even if even though employment growth has slowed, the positive outlook of these businesses could very possibly turn into positive impacts in terms of employment gains, which leads me to this next survey question. So when do you expect the full recovery of the US labor market? Wait till we get about, looks like answers have slowed a little bit, so I'll go ahead and show you guys the responses. So it looks like the majority of you believe that a full recovery of the labor market will happen in 2022, 2023. Some of you believe 2024, 2025. Some of you even believe by the end of this year. Your varying answers are unsurprising because it follows this theme of uncertainty and all the factors of this uncertainty as the United States navigates this recession. But we do sort of have a way to compare in terms of so that we can draw some conclusions about how long it could potentially take us to recover these jobs. So what I've done here is I'm showing you a figure that shows the percentage or the months after pre-recession peak that employment has recovered for each of the 5 last recessions. And what we can see is that for the Great Recession, it took more than 6 years for employment to reach what it was prior to the start of it. For the dot-com bubble, represented by this orange line, took around 4 years. For the recession of 1990, took around 2.5. But for most of the recent recessions, it seems that once jobs start to recover, they seem to recover at somewhat of a similar pace. Given that the current recession's job recovery is around the trough of the Great Recession's job losses, if we were to regain jobs at a similar pace, full job recovery would take around 5 years from the pre-recession peak. In other words, around 4 years from now, so around March of 2025. However, it's possible that once restrictions are fully lifted, we may experience some large employment gains, especially in sectors like leisure and hospitality, who are experiencing a lot of restrictions right now. Should this happen, it could cut several months or even a year from or more from that timeline based on how large those realized gains are. In this scenario, we could experience full employment recovery sometime in 2024. In contrast, if we continue to experience unemployment lulls, it's possible we may not experience a full recovery until late 2025 or early 2026. Much of this recovery depends largely on how quickly people feel that they are able to return to the sort of their normal level of activities, which in turn relies largely on how quickly people become vaccinated. So what this figure shows is the percentage of the 18+ population in each state that has received at least one dose of the vaccination. And you can see the Northeast seems to have some higher percentages. The North has some higher percentages, and the South is lagging just a bit. The more quickly the population is vaccinated and can develop some level of herd immunity, the more quickly things will be able to recover and restrictions will be able to be lifted, especially if it, as I mentioned before, if it were to cause big gains in employment in the leisure and hospitality sector. Also, as more people become vaccinated, we'll see an increase in all kinds of activity like travel, both domestic and foreign. The rollout of the vaccine in Pennsylvania started pretty slowly. However, it's picked up in recent weeks. We seem to be running, middle of the pack in terms of the percentage of our population that's been vaccinated. We have around 39.3% of our 18+ population has received at least one dose. So regardless, the continued rollout of vaccines should continue to enhance consumer confidence significantly in the coming months. So in conjunction with consumer confidence, vaccinations will also increase people's willingness to engage in activities outside of their home, as well as their ability to return to work, should that be what's next for them. So what this figure shows is the index of mobility and engagement. So what it measures is how often people leave their homes and how far they go and how long they stay away. And we noticed that even before restrictions were enacted, mobility dropped significantly at the onset of the pandemic. We saw, like many of these figures, this percent change from February and January 2020 pick up and then sort of stagnate off. In the winter or this really cold January, we saw these levels sort of start to decline. And then in most recent weeks, we've actually seen mobility and engagement pick up a little bit, but then again, stagnate off. It's likely that these mobility engagement will pick up even further as warmer weather comes to stay for the spring and summer months, as well as an even greater portion of the population becomes fully vaccinated. However, it is important to note that we talked about these structural changes in commuting patterns, as well as behavioral shifts in consumption. And we are experiencing a slight spike in current COVID cases. This may continue to keep mobility engagement lower than it was compared to pre-pandemic levels. So given all of this uncertainty that we've discussed today, and even the topics that we didn't cover, I would like to know what's your greatest concern in the next 6 months? I want to make sure it can do, yeah, okay. I'm seeing some responses now. I'll wait till, I'll give you guys about a minute to respond to that before I show you guys the results. And then we can take a look and see what people's biggest concerns are. looks like we have around 15 results and we've sort of, oh, we're still rolling in. Okay, for interest of time, I'll just start showing you guys the responses. So what this is going to do is show the big people that the most concerns are the biggest. So more people that the more people that cited a specific thing, the bigger the word will be. So it looks like many of you are worried about the vaccine. You're worried about stagnation, a spike, another virus spike, the recovery, the resurgence of the virus, businesses, different variants. You guys have a lot of different stuff here. This is the most I've had any group that I've presented this to answer. Go you guys. So it looks like the largest concern for you guys is the vaccine and likely the vaccine rollout and how quickly that will be and how quickly people can get back to normal. So I'll wrap up my presentation just to sort of go over what we've talked about. And the number one thing has been this uncertainty. There are several different levels of uncertainty that are affecting this outlook. Number one is the control of the virus. You know, will there be mutations that are resistant to the vaccines that we already have developed, and how quickly we'll be able to create new vaccines? And, you know, will there be another spike in cases as we sort of open up the economy, and how will that affect businesses? There's also these changes in consumer behavior. We talked about that a lot this presentation. And, you know, it's really difficult to know what changes so far are permanent versus which ones are temporary and will change as we sort of head back into normal behavior territory. And then there's this question of what type of demand is pent up versus which demand is stable. Are people saving their money, or do they plan to spend it once things go back to normal, or do they plan to continue at the savings rates that we've seen? Additionally, support from the government. We've already seen that the most recent stimulus has come out from the CARES Act. They've extended the forbearance and foreclosure moratorium, and stimulus checks have been hitting all this month. So it'll be interesting to see how that stimulus actually impacts the economy in terms of saving and spending. So in summary, the overall impact to businesses is that we're seeing some signs of recovery. Small business does have this stagnated recovery. Fortunately, we've seen a little bit of uptick of that in recent weeks. Most sectors overall were negatively impacted, in particular leisure and hospitality, which suffered the most damage, remains, you know, anywhere between 20 and 30% lower than it was prior to the pandemic. How have consumers reacted so far? Well, there's a lot lower level of consumer confidence, which has resulted in significantly less spending on goods and services. But we have seen these levels of consumer confidence start to pick up in the most recent month, and hopefully they go up from there. And what can we expect in the near term? Well, the pace of recovery has slowed down in recent months, but the news of the vaccines has been positive. It seems like people are reacting well to that, especially consumers with their spending habits. But the near-term outlook largely remains unchanged. So I will stop there and I will take questions from anybody that has them.
Let me start with some of the ones we've had, Leanne, see where we get to. One of the questions was, is it possible that the most recent stimulus funding could cause the economy to overheat and could cause inflation, which could stymie a lot of what the recovery that seems to be happening?
So for that question, you know, I've got a couple of figures here. So the first one is projections. We'll start with the projections of appropriate policy, of what FOMC policymakers believe. So these projections were made as of March 17th, knowing that the stimulus was coming out. So policymakers don't believe that this is going to overheat the economy in a way that they will need to raise interest rates by the end of this year, or even by the end of the majority by the end of 22 or even 2023. So I don't believe that's going to, in my personal opinion, I don't believe that this stimulus alone is going to have an impact in any way in terms of firming inflation so much that we would have to raise interest rates and it would cause all kinds of pressure. And we can sort of see that in the in inflation. So even in February, we haven't seen the impacts of March just yet, but we've still not seen inflation firm to that 2%. And the rules that they've recently changed within the Federal Reserve System is that we're no longer targeting to stay at or below this 2%. It's going to be an average inflation targeting. So even if the economy were to overheat, we would allow it to overheat for a little bit of time to sort of make up for how long we've been in hitting below that target. So I don't think that policymakers are extremely worried about any kind of stimulus overheating the economy as much as just boosting the consumption that we need to get employers back on track and sort of get these employment gains that we need to be, back where we were prior to the pandemic.
Another one that we had was what kind of impact, is there any way of knowing what kind of impact the increased unemployment compensation had in turn on employment, people being willing to return to work or being able to return to work?
So I'm assuming the question is, do you think that the increased employment compensation incentivized people to not work?
Yeah, I think that's probably some of it, yeah.
So I think this is sort of a double-edged sword in a few aspects. So this was a largely, this pandemic largely hit people in leisure and hospitality, and largely hit people at lower income brackets, and largely people at these, essential workers and things like that. So I don't think that the increased income, to me, spoke to disincentivizing workers to work as much as it made people realize that a lot of people are underpaid. And we need to be able to raise people's incomes in these brackets. If that's what our government has decided is a living wage for a time when several people are unemployed, I don't think, in my opinion, the takeaway should be that it disincentivized people to work. I don't think we've seen that in the data, that people didn't return to work because of it. But I think the takeaway should be that
Raise
the living wages,
yeah.
the living wage is too low.
Is there any way of identifying income loss for people who remained employed?
Income loss. So, or do you mean like people that were brought down part-time?
Yeah,
Or
wages might have been reduced, or their working hours might have been reduced. But they remained.
There
I asked the
is,
question also if they took a pay cut, as in they took a different, position or something like that and ended up employed but underemployed.
So I have two figures that will sort of help clarify this question. So the first is growth in average hourly earnings. Well, let's start with this one. So we'll start with the U.S. unemployment rate. So the U.S. unemployment rate is the headline rate is U3, which is this black line, which is indicative of anybody that is looking for a job and can't find work. And it doesn't include people who are underemployed. The U6 measure of employment takes into account those people who are working, but are working at a job that is either below their skill set or they're only able to work part-time. And we can see that number is always historically been above U3. So there's always more people that are underemployed, but it seemed to follow the same general trend as unemployment overall. So it was much higher than unemployment, and it still stands, at 11% of people are experiencing those disruptions. So yes, there are several people that still fall in this, but what a lot of the research has shown so far is people that are in those positions are people at the lower end of the income distributions. And to sort of put a segue into what Julia mentioned earlier, that's why the Federal Reserve is starting to create tools that help people with that occupational mobility based on the skill set that they have and skill sets that they can go to that can help them sort of increase their income. So that is something that is happening.
A lot of the data that you gave us focuses on states or counties. Is there any way of differentiating between what the impact has been, what the recovery means for urban areas versus rural areas in general?
There has been, and I do not want to misquote this paper, so I'm actually going to take that question. There has been a paper that came out from the Federal Reserve. They have a whole COVID series, and I just read it, and I don't want to misquote the paper on what the impacts were. Yeah, I believe in my head I have the answer, but I don't even want to misquote you guys. So I'll take that question in an email, and then I'll give you guys what that paper says.
We'll send that one to you.
Yep.
You focused on two sort of dramatic trends that could have long-term consequences. How and when is the Fed going to be able to make some decisions about, are they permanent changes or temporary changes? One is consumer spending and where they're buying it, mainly moving to online. We're starting to see all the shopping centers in this area start to close. And the other one is the fact that more and more people are working remotely, and I'm presuming or thinking they're going to continue to work remotely. What impact that's going to have on different counties, different locations. I think there's some hope here that people will move to smaller cities like Reading rather than staying in Philadelphia. So I don't know if you've done any research or have any instincts about that, or how you're going to be able to tell that when it's happening.
So there's a couple things at play here, right? So I did mention throughout the presentation that it's a really difficult time, and the Fed now more than ever is using real-time data indicators to try to figure these things out, because it is changing so rapidly. But it is, as I pushed throughout this presentation, is that we don't know until we know. Do you know? So we don't know how many people, until restrictions are fully lifted, we're not going to know how many employers will choose to stay virtual or stay partly virtual. We know some people have already said they plan to, because they've already invested in the technology and they've already done those things. So to be able to parse out that impact currently, that's the uncertainty that we have right now. We just don't know. Nobody could really know. But the second part of that is, what are the potential consequences? So the potential consequences are, shuttered businesses in certain areas. So if you think about the potential impact of, like, Philadelphia, there are several commuters that travel into the city from the surrounding suburbs to go to work here. It's also, a pretty high level of education of those people that come in. And we know from COVID-related research that the commuting patterns were more heavily impacted for more educated workers. So more educated workers were able to work remotely more easily. So if those people stay remote, you'll sort of see those people bleed out into the cities, and then you'll see businesses, eateries, things like that suffer within the economy. But then there will be sort of a replenishment of those wherever those people decide to move. Now, where do those people decide to move? Well, the impact this has had on the housing market, there are just so many dominoes, because the impact this has had on the housing market is there are so many people that want to move to the suburbs, and so many people that don't want to move now because of the pandemic and because refinance rates are so low that, there's a supply and demand shock, right? People don't want to sell, and a lot more people want to buy. So what happens in terms of the structural changes? How many people will change their mind in that time and be like, oh, well, restrictions are lifted, I'll stay in the city because of these housing market pressures? And how many will continue to buy when that happens? The answer to your question is there's just so many moving parts.
Yeah.
In terms of, we need to first parse out what the permanent changes are before we can say, there are a lot of, like, colleges, if people move away from, if businesses shuttered. So for example, in my hometown of Morgantown, that's where I went to college, Morgantown, West Virginia, a huge company just closed there, a chemical company or a pharmaceutical company closed and shuttered hundreds of jobs. There you will see a dispersion of people. I've already seen it happening, of people moving away from that area because they just employed so many people. It's hard to tell how many things like that will happen regionally, and it's going to happen. As I mentioned earlier, this pandemic is really geographic. If you have big companies that prop up entire economies that then fail, the impacts can be massive.
Yeah. You talked about the difference in the impact on the service sector employment and manufacturing employment, and I'm going to let one of our audience members talk about this quickly, but he raised the issue of manufacturing employment in Berks County, which is a major part of our economy. Berks County is still one of the manufacturing centers of Pennsylvania, actually declined. So Dan, I don't know if you want to weigh in.
Yeah, Leanne, go Mountaineers, by the way.
Ah, thanks.
So this is Dan Fogarty of the Workforce Board. I love your presentation. I always learn so much and try to put out on the chat some local data that folks might find of interest. The first thing has to do with this chart where you show manufacturing job loss in the Reading MSA being almost 10% year over year. There's a BLS wobble that I would characterize as a, I would call it the BLS. We were playing blackjack last year at the BLS casino. And like everybody else, we didn't get real great cards initially, but we started counting cards. And what the BLS was reporting consistently August to December was that the Berks County was the only MSA in the region that actually had labor force growth year over year. So that was all reported through December, and it showed that we had recovered. We had 0% job loss December to December. And then then we were counting cards, and they caught us counting cards, and they reshuffled the deck, and we ended up back in the middle of the pack. So there's a technical issue there in the statistics that maybe offline you can explain to me, because you're a lot smarter than I am. But the real issue to bring forward to you from locally is we probably have 1,000 to 2,000 open jobs in manufacturing right now. And the employers, largely not on this call, cannot fill those jobs despite raising wages $3 to $5 an hour. It's second shift, it's third shift, and there are no applicants. So when you talk about wages being the issue, I got to push back on that a little bit. It looks to us it's a little more complex like that, and particularly it has to do with the impact of families with school-aged children. It's tough to work shift work when you don't know what your kid's schedule is from week to week. And we've worked with United Way and the Chamber going back to July to try to understand that, but it appears there's a major exodus of women in particular with school-aged children that is kind of not showing up in your presentation. I just wanted to have you react to that. Are what we're seeing in Berks County, are other regions, MSA, seeing that thing where women had it? You can pay them all you want, but if they don't know what their kid's schedule is and daycare and everything else, they cannot, hold down a manufacturing job or probably a healthcare job, for example. Would you like to react to that?
I would, yes. So first, I would like to say that yes, what you're talking about is women and school-aged children, women with school-aged children. There's tons of studies going on right now that talk about that are working on the implications of what this will look like for women having to exit the workforce due to these pressures. So I'll come back to that in a second. But the other thing I wanted to note was, so first, these annual unemployment growth figures, what these represent are not jobs available. This is the amount of people that are employed within this sector. So I see what you mean in that it isn't reflective. This sector may be a lot bigger if they could find people to fill the jobs, but they haven't been able to find people to fill the jobs. So I'm asking, because I don't know, this seems to me like some of the pressures that were being faced prior to the pandemic. So prior to the start of this pandemic, we were facing this, skills mismatch where there were a lot of jobs open. There were just no candidates to fill the jobs that needed filled. So I wonder if what you're talking about, like there are these construction jobs, was this a persistent trend prior to the pandemic, or?
Yes. So prior to the pandemic, at the end of 2019, we had a high level of churn in entry-level positions, which was like twice what you saw in other MSAs. So because of the availability of those, they really are not high-skilled jobs. A lot of the jobs that are open is if you can get to work, right, and follow instructions and, work safely, they're not necessarily the higher skilled technical jobs. Those were the jobs where there was a very high turnover, where people were just bouncing from employer to employer because they could. And so the employers were complaining about the quality of applicants, but they were still seeing applicants. Right? They had to sift through, and they had a retention issue, which could be related to wages, right? But then what happened post-pandemic, when they came out of it, they were saying to us, we are not even getting.
Now we don't even have applicants.
That's the distinction between pre and post here in Berks County.
Interesting. So now you don't even have people that are applying for those jobs.
Right, despite, like, if you had companies that were paying, lower end, like 13, 14, 15, they are literally now offering 17, 18, 19, maybe even 20, and they are still not attracting
They're
any.
still having trouble attracting.
To the point, Leanne, is, and I don't know if there are any manufacturing employers, and I'll turn it back over to Dave, is they're bypassing orders right now. It's not that they don't have the orders, and it's not that they don't have the plant equipment. They do not have the people on second and third shift to ship those orders.
So Leanne, this is where the session we had 2 weeks ago about skills-based employment occupational opportunities could really be a very, very helpful way of trying to address that issue, that there are skills that people may have that could translate to a different position that could help meet this need.
Absolutely. So that's the whole point of that skills-based tool, is to help people find that. And I'm interested to know where, like, are the people that used to hold these jobs, are they on unemployment? Are the people that used to hold these jobs of a certain age range or at-risk population that isn't willing or ready to go back to work? It's something I'm going to look into. Honestly, it's very, very interesting, and I'm happy that you brought it up. So I'll hopefully have some more insight for you.
If we can help on that, let us know.
But we also have yet another one that we did with the Federal Reserve about transportation to work being a challenge, particularly in some locations. Two final questions. We'll let you be relieved from Reading in a few minutes. One is, obviously, there was a lot of demand created for funding from the state and local governments, from our school districts. They suffered because their tax revenues were significantly based on income and property values, property taxes being paid. Are you seeing that start to recover now with the recovery?
Schools recover. So one thing I've heard about schools, that my sister's actually a teacher, and I have a couple of friends that are teachers within Philadelphia. So what I've mostly heard and what I've deduced from this is that schools are allowing these sort of dual systems, which allow some students to go back in person if they need to go back in person, and they're allowing some students to virtually learn if they would like to virtually learn. So what this does is it actually has a really large impact on the funding that schools receive. If a school has, 80% of its kids decide that they want to do this virtual learning, they lose a portion of funding and they have to let teachers go. So even with this relief funding that's coming in, schools have to meet certain criteria to continue to get the funding that they were getting before. So in terms of the recovery of that, I haven't concretely, I would have to look into what the exact research says about it, but my inclination is that until students are going back full time, there is going to be a funding issue, just because federal and school or local and state school budgets are going to be basing their funding on those choices until all students go back.
Right. Okay. And the last question, if I can, is today in Pittsburgh, the president's announcing his significant infrastructure proposal, which also carries some very significant tax consequences. And I'm presuming the Fed has had some opportunity to think about some of that. What is the impact, you think, on the economy in terms of the infrastructure investment and the revenue sources that are going to be necessary to pay for it?
So I'm going to be entirely honest with you. I'm not well versed on the infrastructure bill that was pitched today. However, I'm more than happy to look into it and give you guys a synopsis of how I think the prices will, or how that will impact in terms of economic consequences, which
Good.
I will do directly after this presentation.
Yeah, some of us are very excited about the investment in infrastructure. There are a bunch of us who've been working on restoring passenger rail service to Reading, so that's exciting on the one hand. But there are tax consequences on the other end to pay for it, and so there's some question about what that means.
Well, in terms of just on the broad spectrum, you know, with all the stimulus that's coming out, I mean, I imagine the tax implications currently, they have
Yes.
to raise taxes to a significant level to be able to cover the debt we've had to take out for these current stimuluses, along with something as large as infrastructure. But again, it's something I would have to look into.
Okay. Well, an incredible presentation. Thank you. I think it was a lot to absorb. I want to let everybody know we will provide you with a link to the video of this program today. Leanne, if you're okay, I will also mail out to everybody your PowerPoint, your presentation, and we will look for responses to the questions. I think you've answered a lot of them already, but thank you. This is really terrific. Very, very good.
Well, I really enjoyed speaking to you guys today, and I look forward to getting the answers to your questions out to you guys.
Great.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everybody, for joining with us, and have a good rest of your day.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, Miss Cat.